Tonight's program is being presented to us by Jim Meverden, and Jim has been a longtime collector and has an extreme interest in Milwaukee, the city, and has exhibited and collected Milwaukee advertising covers. In fact, I believe he's given a program to that effect to ATA at one time. So Jim, I think we'll let you get started. Everybody that I see on the list here is local. I'm not sure who 14144439262 is. If you would identify yourself, that would be appreciated. It's a phone in.
I'm 90. The phone number, this is Tom Borowski.
Okay. And Tom, you're local too, aren't you?
Yes, I'm West Dallas, actually, yes.
Okay, so Jim had asked the question whether everybody was local, and that would sort of tell how he might slant the presentation. So Jim, we're all local.
Very good.
So if you'd like to get started, I'm anxious to hear your presentation.
All right. Well, this all started sort of by happenstance. Mary Ann knew I had an interest in Milwaukee because I had exhibited advertising covers, and she happened to have a couple of boxes of Milwaukee postcards, and I had a couple of cigar boxes of Milwaukee postcards that I inherited from my late father-in-law, and I had really never looked at them. There was, like I say, a couple cigar boxes, so a lot of them, but I didn't have much interest in postcards. So she said, why don't you put together a presentation on postcards in Milwaukee? And so I did. So that's what we're going to talk about. October 1st is World Postcard Day, and the worldpostcardday.com is their website. It's a nice website, international in scope. And then part of their organization is called Post Crossing. And it's almost, I didn't do a lot of research. I'm not a member yet, but it almost seems like a pen pal organization for postcards. And it's something like 209 countries and 80,000 members. And that's the www.postcrossing.com. And I bring that up because there was an article in Lynn's, the most recent Lynn's, that Post Crossing is going to have one of their meetups, what they call a meetup, where some of the people that send postcards will be able to meet each other in person. And they're going to have that at Milwaukee this year. So it'll be real interesting. I'm going to attend that meetup, even if I'm not a member, just to see what goes on. But I sort of found a lot more interest in postcards than I thought I would, not only from the Milwaukee aspect, but from the aspect of what their uses were and a little bit of their history. And as everybody knows, they're just great for fast communications, and that's really been their intent all along. And I guess because I have more of a business background, I found the uses of them in business more interesting, and we'll get into some of that. I'm going to do this talk in two parts. I'm going to cover a brief history of the postcard using Milwaukee cards as props. And then we'll go into almost a travel log of Milwaukee and what some of the landmarks and monuments and recreational activities, just sort of a scattergun approach of Milwaukee postcards. And I'll start off by saying probably 80% of the postcards that are in this exhibit are either mine or Mary Ann's, and then the other 20% I pilfered from the Smithsonian has a lot of postcards online. A company, a printer out of Chicago called Kurt Teich, who's probably the largest printer of postcards in history. They've got thousands and thousands of postcards on their site that are searchable by location, by subject, and the Milwaukee County Historical Society has postcards online, and the Milwaukee Public Library also has postcards online. So there's a lot of cards, and like I say, probably 20% here are pilfered, and the other 80% we own, just to give you a heads up. Here's a typical postcard from 19-teens or 1920s showing what people around the world and around the country thought of Milwaukee. The novelty postcards are almost all beer-centric, and Dachshunds, given they must have thought everybody was German, Frankfurters for the wheels. And when we cover a few more novelty postcards, you'll see that theme throughout. So postcards have probably been mailed since about 1861. And in the early 1860s, a guy by the name of Charlton copyrighted the idea for a postal card. And then he sold the copyright or transferred the postcard to one of his employees, H.L. Lippman. And Lippman sort of went all out. And this is one of his early cards, the orange card. And you can see the space for the stamp and the lines for the address. On the reverse of his advertising card were all the benefits that could be achieved by using his postal cards. And they're listed there, and they're the same advantages that I'll refer to a few times. Half the price, in this case, half the price of the papers and the paper and the envelopes. Unfortunately, at this point, they still had to pay the same postal rate as letters. Ready for instant dispatch, that's an appeal to businesses. You could print your message on the back of the card in full. All you had to do was put a stamp on it, address it, and send it out. A convenient mode of ordering goods. We'll see some cards later on that were used by businesses to use as order forms. You can see one notation, the next one valuable to travelers, which is probably the primary use over the years. Useful to societies. Milwaukee Philatelic Society still sends postcards to announce their events. I don't know if they still do, but they used to send out postcards, and I've got a few that MPS sent out announcing their meetings, when they'd be held, where they'd be held. So again, the advantages are still in effect today. So unfortunately, about 1872, the government finally issued a postal card with postage. They allowed discounted postage. And so that sort of put Lippman out of business. He sort of faded away because he still had to, he couldn't charge the lower rate for postage, and the government cards were readily available and could be printed up just like his. So here's a postal card from the Lindemann Company. They were a metalworking firm in Milwaukee that made, as you can see, stoves and heaters, sheet metalware. And this is a card just announcing that we've received your order, and that we'll give it our prompt attention. So that was a common use back then. So at this point, private publishers like Lippman were still allowed to print postcards, but they still couldn't get, as I said, they still couldn't get the cheaper rate. Here's a couple more government cards. You can see the one on the left, Everett A. Smith, a grocer in Milwaukee. And this was a card to announce that a salesman would be coming with, and it's unused, so the date's not filled in, but it was announcing a salesman would come visit with samples. The card on the right is Milwaukee Bag Company and their price list, and it fit nicely on the card. A lot of information packed there, so it met the needs of both the customer and the vendor. So the next phase, or the next era of cards, is the private mailing card era. And this was real short, 1898 to 1901. It was, as you can see on this card, it was authorized by Congress in 1898. Each card had to have the words private mailing card, indicating that it wasn't a postal card, it wasn't government produced. And then on this particular card, you'll see up above the private mailing card language is postal card, and then carte postale. And that carte postale indicates that this card was allowed in international mailings. This is from C.N. Casper, who was a publisher, author, bookseller in Milwaukee. And he lasted, I think, from like 1880 to 1930, something like that. And he was an author of German English dictionaries. He was an author of Milwaukee travel logs, travel brochures. He printed postcards, and he also had a big German English bookstore. And we'll mention that a little later, another one of his. So one of the rules for postal private mailing cards was it could not have a message on the front. Well, I found this card, and it's got the authorization language on, authorized by act of Congress, but it has the message on the card. And I get the feeling this guy was maybe a bit of a shyster, because he's selling on the front of the card And you'll excuse me, I always get the front and back of postcards mixed up. But he advertises on the address side harness riveter that he's selling, and then you can't read the fine print on the reverse. But what he says is, send me 10 cents in silver, and I'll send you issues of my newsletter that has a lot of money-making opportunities. So sort of when I was a kid, you saw that sort of thing on matchbooks. So next period is the postcard period, and this is also called the undivided back period. So the back of a postcard up until now just had the address on it, and that's all that was allowed on it. The next period will be called the divided back, which brings us more into modern times. But this period is called the undivided back. They were now able to be called postcards. They were now private printers and government printers were now allowed to use the same postal rate. And mainly they had images on one side with a small area for message, and then of course only the address on the other side. This one's for Schlitz Brewing. You can see a picture of the brewery or a drawing of the brewery up above. And at that time, they claimed to be the largest brewer in the world. And then down below is the Schlitz Palm Garden, which was their beer garden, which for those of you that know Milwaukee was sort of tucked behind what is now Grand Avenue Mall on 3rd and 3rd just Wisconsin. A couple more things from that same era, still the undivided back period, but leather postcards came into being in that period. They were pretty short-lived because the post office banned their use after 1910, but I assume because they had to be hard to handle. This is a card that I got from my father-in-law, and they had to be hard to make because that whole image is burned in. So I assume they could burn the holding my own in Milwaukee part of it in advance. But then the address had to be done, I suppose, while you wait. And then it was mailed directly from there. The little inset image is a pillow I found online of someone who sewed together a bunch of leather postcards. Well, interesting, huh? Just what you want. The picture on the right, postcard on the right, is of Lake Park in Milwaukee. And because a lot of Milwaukee postcards have photographs or have images of landmarks and places to go, you'll see an abundance of Lake Park postcards. So we're getting to the end of the periods. Here we're into the divided back period, pre-World War I. This is the era of real photo postcards. And this era was sort of the high point of postcard mailing. You see the one blurb there. In 1908, 678 million postcards were sent, and the whole population of the country, the entire population, was 88.7 million. So that means every man, woman, and child in the country sent out an average of about 9 postcards that year. So Kodak came out with the camera. The picture of the camera is the folding pocket Kodak 3A camera. And the negative was sized exactly like the postcard. What is it, 3.5 by 5 inches? So you take an image, you take it to the processor, he would make 1 or more postcards for you, and you could then mail them out. The divided back period, this is a good example of a photo divided back postcard from Northwestern Mutual Life, and this announces the 35th annual meeting of their agents that took place in 1911. That annual meeting has been going on since 1911 minus 35, 1870 or so, and right up until today. They had the last one just last month. They estimate it brings about 50,000 people into town to wine and dine and go to educational seminars on insurance. One other interesting fact of this postcard is it was sent out in 1911 depicting their new headquarters building, but it was printed before the building was completed. Some of the real photo postcards: World War I soldier on the left, the Cudahy Fire Department up in the upper right. And these are all from around 1910. And then the funniest one on the right, and the image is very poor, but the little inscription on the top says Ma and Walter in the backyard, 279 33rd Street, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So you can see these real photo postcards really brought things home. They were really making it personal. You'll find photo postcards of that people took of fires. You'll find people took of landscapes. I've got a whole bunch in one of my boxes, and they were all too boring to put in here. It's a picture of the lake, a couple of waves on the lake, or a picture of a statue. But some of them are very interesting. You can see they were personal to these people. So the whiteboard period, again, this skirts or this during the World War I period, and prior to World War I, a good percentage of the postcards were made by German printers, and their print quality was high. And of course, with coming of World War I, they decided to bring a lot of the postcard printing back home because of the anti-German sentiment. American printing wasn't quite as good, and there's two reasons why the whiteboarders were instituted. I've read two different theories. One is it was done to save ink, which I kind of doubt. And the second reason is that it allowed the printers a little more error when they cut the cards. And you can imagine if you've got a card that goes the full width of the paper, if your cut is off, you've got a little bit of the adjacent card on that one. And so that makes a little more sense. But so in 1917, 1918, American printers took over and their print quality wasn't quite as good. Here are some cards from that era. Again, Milwaukee, the Milwaukee skyline, looking at it from Government Pier, the North Avenue Dam, and the Lakefront Water Tower. So again, places, a lot of water, and of course, because it's Milwaukee. So the linen period, I'm sure you've all seen postcards that have sort of a texture. Well, they went to a higher rag content during this period, higher rag content paper, which allowed to have some texture. All of a sudden, the color got a little deeper. The printing got a little improved. Kurt Teich is probably the one that popularized, or one of the early linen printers, and his first one was in 1931. And that period lasted, I list here till 45. All these dates are pretty fuzzy, but 1945. But the photochrome, which is the next and last era, really started appearing in 1939. This is a picture of the Schrader Hotel, which still exists downtown Milwaukee. It was Al Capone's home away from home in the 1930s, and then it was bought out by the Marcus Brothers, and so it became the Mark Plaza, and now it's the Hilton City Center. Oh, sorry about that. A few more linen cards, and they don't all have white borders. Some do, some don't. But the Milwaukee Clipper, which is an auto ferry that went from Milwaukee to Muskegon, Michigan, Cathedral Square, and the Gardens in Grant Park, which is on the southeast side of Milwaukee. So now we come into modern postcards, 1945 to present, photochrome. Sometimes it's spelled without an E. Some postcard collectors, I understand, just call them chromes. But they first appeared in 1939 when the Union Oil Company decided to carry them at their gas stations. And this was sort of the time period when people started using them as souvenirs rather than mailing. Of course, a lot of them still got mailed, but people would pick them up for souvenirs. That's what I do. The photographers that take pictures for postcards are usually better than what I can take, so they make fine souvenirs. Three more modern cards, Joan of Arc Chapel, the Midwest Express. I've got a whole series of souvenir postcards from Midwest Express. For those that don't remember, that was a relatively short-lived airline in Milwaukee that catered to business travelers. Their excuse me, their Fares were a little bit higher, but their service was great. All the seats were first class. I did a lot of traveling at that time, and whenever I could, I got on Midwest Express. But price
They also
competition,
made great cookies.
they had great cookies. Hi, Rob. And it's too bad they went out of business. But and then down below that is a postcard I found. I don't know where they got the date. They claim 1893 to 1993, the 100th anniversary of the postcard. It's a neat card. I put it in here, but I have no idea where they got 1893. So now we're going to start the second part. Sort of a travelogue of Milwaukee. We're going to cover a lot of Milwaukee cards pretty fast. And again, it's picture postcards, so it's a big group of pictures. There were quite a number of printers in Milwaukee that printed postcards. If you collect cards, you'll see E.C. Kropp, Annenberg, Faber, and C.N. Casper. C.N. Casper was pretty short-lived. His window was pretty short. E.C. Kropp is probably the one you'll see the most of. This is a Kropp postcard, greetings from Milwaukee, and then an advertising cover that I have in my collection. Landmarks, Milwaukee is a water town, so you will see, I bet half of Milwaukee postcards have water in them because the lakefront, the skylines, the Milwaukee River, and some of the bridges, postcards, people that printed postcards love bridges. Some of my favorite postcards though are the one like in the lower right where they actually labeled the individual landmarks or buildings on the card. So you could actually go to that same spot and see how it exists today. The card on top is for a German English Academy that was printed by C.N. Casper. And I mentioned before, C.N. Casper was a printer, publisher, author in Milwaukee with a bookstore. And because his bookstore had a lot of German English dictionaries and German language books, it's only appropriate that he did one for a German English Academy. The one on the lower left and lower right, one is City Hall at night, which is a dramatic picture that I have never seen another postcard with City Hall at night. And then City Hall Square, as it looked back in the 19 teens. City Hall is depicted on a lot of early postcards in Milwaukee because it was printed, because City Hall was completed in 1895. So it was a dramatic undertaking and a dramatic building. So it's depicted on a lot of postcards. Another one, Lake Park in the upper left, the concrete stairway that leads up to the Lake Park Pavilion. Another one, a Schlitz Palm Garden, the Schlitz Beer Garden that I mentioned before. One of the library that's still standing. And in the lower right is the conservatory at what's now the VA. Back then it was called National Soldiers Home. So Frederick Law Olmsted was an architect that designed the Milwaukee Park system. And one of the parks he designed was Washington Park. And he designed Washington Park to have a zoo. So it had a zoo in the period before World War I. They claimed to be the 6th largest zoo in the country. And the upper left postcard shows their buffaloes, and they had African animals and a lot of birds. And it was sort of a first-class zoo at that time. But as time went on, of course, the strategy or the zoos, it was an old-fashioned zoo with small cages for the animals. And the approach for zoos changed to give them a little more wildlife habitat, a little more room to breathe. So in the 40s, they started thinking about expanding Washington Park, but then they decided to look for another location instead. They found the location in the current Milwaukee County Zoo, and that's the postcard on the lower right with Samson the gorilla. And Samson was a fixture there when I moved here in the 70s, and he died in 1981, but he lived at the Milwaukee County Zoo from 59 to 81. I was just at the zoo last year with my couple of nephews, and we rode the train. The train still exists as it's depicted right there. So the upper left card is the Exposition Center that burned down in 1905. And in its place, they built the auditorium in this card below it called the new auditorium. In the upper right is the conservatory that was located in Mitchell Park until about the 1950s when the domes were constructed, the Mitchell Park domes in the lower right card. So the domes now are in a bit of disrepair. I think everybody that lives in Milwaukee, I hope everybody that lives in Milwaukee has been to the domes because they're pretty dramatic. But their fate is currently under discussion because the cost of new domes or the cost of a new horticultural garden is high. The cost of repairing and refurbishing these domes is also high. So we'll see where that leads. More landmarks. The Eagles Club still exists. Now it's called the Rave/Eagles Club. And private parties, concerts. It's a big ballroom. It has a big ballroom for a lot of different kinds of events. The Milwaukee Yacht Club, as it existed back then. I think the Milwaukee Yacht Club came into being in the 1870s, and it looks a lot different than this now. The Deutscher Club, Alexander Mitchell was a local real estate tycoon. He owned the Milwaukee Railroad, and he owned a mansion on the west side. And the Deutscher Club, which was a German-American club, whose intent was a social club, but whose intent was to improve relations between Germany and America, took over the mansion in 1890 something and made it their club. And then, of course, with World War I approaching, the anti-German sentiment that was converted to, the name was changed to the Wisconsin Club, as it still exists today. The postcard on the lower right was announcing a 1902 garden concert that the Deutsche Club was sponsoring, and Joseph Sheehan was going to be the singer du jour. So some recreational activities. They didn't have screens then. They didn't have TV. Radio was just around. So the upper left is concert goers at Lake Park. The upper right was the Plankington Arcade. The Plankington Arcade was a group of shops, sort of the precursor to the shops of Grand Avenue that we looked at a modern postcard in that same location. The Whitefish Bay Resort is depicted in the lower left. Whitefish Bay was not yet a suburb as it is today, but the bay was called Whitefish Bay then, like it is now. And there were train lines coming up from Milwaukee to the Whitefish Bay Resort so people could spend a day at the lake. I didn't even know until the lower right card depicts what's called Wonderland. I didn't even know this existed. For anybody that's been to the Hubbard Park Lodge for their Sunday buffet, the Wonderland, an amusement park that was also called Coney Island of Milwaukee, existed on Hubbard Park, in Hubbard Park. And it had roller coasters and big slides and water slides and the big swings on ropes. And until a couple of years ago, I didn't even know that existed. So interesting. Recreation consists of sports, 3 relatively modern postcards. Upper left is Milwaukee County Stadium, where the Braves and the Brewers played. And then Miller Park in the upper right, which is now American Family Field, where the Brewers play. And then probably the most famous Bucks team down below with Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. And I think that's 1972-1973 season. So in the 1920s, aviation was a big, exciting thing. And Milwaukee was not left out of that. So in the upper left, it's an advertising card for a furniture store called Hartman's. And I doubt that you can read the caption, but it says, "Ho, see the man bird in the air, taking his bride to Hartman's, where he'll feather their nest with feathers new." And Hartman's was a furniture store, so the birds interesting. To the right is a advertising card from the Milwaukee Journal and WTMJ for Lindbergh's flight across America after he got back to this country. And below is another aviation related card, 1928. A German-Irish group called the Bremen Flyers flew across the Atlantic, and after they got to this country, then they did a national tour, and this is commemorating their stop in Milwaukee. So novelty cards, as I mentioned with the one earlier, you can see the theme on all three of these cards: beer, 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 and beer. The one in the upper right is Neptune. And for those that can't read the caption, it said, "I'd rather command one glass of beer than all the water in the sphere." So, and of course, there's a tribute to Wisconsin's dairy industry on the upper left card, the tiny little cow. This is my favorite novelty card. Again, the Dachshund, bottled beer, the batter using a beer bottle for a bat. Almost every position's drinking a beer while they're playing. The third baseman sitting on a barrel of sauerkraut. The teams on the scoreboard, the loggers in the box, and the pitcher of beer representing the pitcher. They must have, I don't know what people thought of Milwaukee back then. Seems like almost all the novelty cards I run across are that. Political cards, like today, politicians send out postcards. The two guys down on the bottom, I really didn't pay much attention, so I don't know if they won or lost. Dahlquist and Lansing Hoyt. These are both from the 40s. All three of these cards are from the 1940s. Carl Zeidler was the mayor of Milwaukee for 2 years, from 1940 to 1942. And he was a pilot in World War II and got killed during the war.
I will.
In 1948, his brother, Frank, was elected mayor. And Carl was a Democrat, but Frank was an avowed socialist and ran on that platform. And Frank Zeidler happened to be a good friend of my in-laws. So he actually came to our wedding. Very intelligent, very well spoken. Even into his 90s, he knew exactly what was going on with the city. You could ask his opinion. Fascinating guy. Education, of course, it seems like schools have always had postcards. The state normal school, and then after it was refurbished, are the top two cards. That school was bought out or merged with UWM. The Wisconsin Downer College in the lower left, that's that property is now part of UWM, but it was actually a female seminary prior to being the Downer College. And then it got bought out by Lawrence College of Appleton, which is now, of course, Lawrence University. And it was demolished, and that land was also bought by UWM. And then the lower right, Marquette University and the Jesuit Church. That science building still sort of exists, not quite in that form, but I spent time there in the 70s taking engineering classes. There are three monuments. Every city where I looked at postcards of monuments, every city has monuments depicted on postcards. These are three representative ones: Washington Monument on Grand Avenue, which is now Wisconsin Avenue, Leif Erikson in Juneau Park, and the Soldiers Monument also on Grand Avenue. 4 famous hotels, different eras. The 3 Republican House, the St. Charles Hotel, and the Plankton House have all been long demolished. But the lower right, Pfister Hotel, is still a 4-star hotel in Milwaukee and has been serving people over 100 years. Modern cards. I don't have many modern cards in this presentation, but here are some modern postcards of Milwaukee destinations: UW Milwaukee, Summerfest, the Calatrava Museum, and a Milwaukee Public Museum card I just picked up last week at the museum of the old world, Wisconsin. So now I'm going to talk, just wind it down with business and industry, which is sort of my forte in Milwaukee more than anything else. Of course, we start out with breweries. These are three relatively modern cards. The Miller card I picked up myself sometime probably in the 70s. The Blatz and the Pabst are both modern cards with older images on them. Johnson Service Company, now Johnson Controls, is now they're headquartered in Ireland, but for a long time they were the biggest publicly held company in Milwaukee. And they sent out a series of postcards to customers, and I assume wannabe customers, of buildings in which they had their temperature control systems installed in. That was their claim to fame, one of their claims to fame around the turn of the century, and it's still their claim to fame today, building automation, building temperature control. And this is the Polk County Courthouse in Des Moines, Iowa, but I've also seen cards for the Leighton Art Museum in Milwaukee and for the Pfister. Pfister was the first Milwaukee hotel to install Johnson's temperature control system. The mail truck there was built by Johnson. They built trucks from 1900 to 1915. And for you stamp collectors out there, the series of special delivery stamps that show a mail truck, that depicts a Johnson truck. And so you can see if we're good enough for Uncle Sam, we're good enough for you. The upper card predates, the upper card's from about the turn of the century. The lower card is from the, I don't know, 1950s or something like that. But I didn't know until a couple of years ago that Palmolive soap was invented in Milwaukee. It was invented by the B.J. Johnson Soap Company, and he started up a soap business here because he was able to use the tallow from the meat packing industry to make soap. Well, in the 1890s, he decided that consumers wanted a milder soap. And so he decided to make it out of palm oil and olive oil, called it Palmolive. Palmolive came out on the market in 1898. He sent cards like this to thousands and thousands and thousands of customers, giving them a free cake. And he would send them to various stores. They would put their name on the cards and then get reimbursed. The equivalent of a modern day coupon. But I didn't know that. And Palmolive soap was manufactured in Milwaukee until the 1930s. The company was renamed, I think 1906, it was renamed from B.J. Johnson Soap Company to Palmolive. But Palmolive the Palmolive company moved to Chicago in 1923, and then to New Jersey, and now it's part of, I don't even know who, but the name still exists. And I just found it funny that I didn't know all these years that it was invented in Milwaukee. The lower card is just a card from Wisconsin Electric Power Company telling people where to mail their remittance. But what I really wanted to find and could not find in time for this was one of the cards that I'm sure a lot of you guys remember getting back in probably the 60s. And it was a card that showed a little drawing of the meters, and you would actually mark in what the meter readings were on the card, send that back to the power company, and that's what they based your bill on. And I could not find that for Wisconsin Electric Power, but I know it existed because I remember coming to my parents' house. A couple more quick ones. The Benjamin Young Company was a mail order company. They had a big catalog. This is just a receipt for their order of a harness. So someone ordered a harness, they got the order, they sent a card saying we're in receipt, we're going to dispatch it as quickly as possible. On the right is an advertising card for the Billings Piano Company. Billings had a separate company that made spring brass flanges, and I didn't even know what those were until the other day, but the flange is part of the hammer assembly that makes the piano make noise. And every hammer assembly has a flange, and they're made out of wood. They were made out of wood then. A lot of them are still made out of wood, but Billings had a better idea and made them out of brass. Some cards fold. Here's one of Marianne's cards that actually folds, gets mailed as a postcard, I don't think they could call it a postcard, so it's called a souvenir mailing card. And then it would be unsealed by the recipient. On the address side contained just the address. It was from the undivided period. The advertisement for the photographer was pretty extensive, included a picture of him with his camera. And then when you opened it up, you got a panoramic view of Milwaukee based on one of his photographs. So an effective advertising technique. Harley Davidson has to be represented. And here are 3 cards from different eras. The upper card from the 50s, the card on the lower left from the 70s, and the card on the right from the 2020s. Ellis Chalmers, the upper card mentions Tune In, the National Farm and Home Hour. That was a radio show that lasted from the late 20s to the late 50s, put on by NBC and sponsored by the USDA, United States Department of Agriculture. And then they had sub-sponsors, and Ellis Chalmers was one of those. And they had a whole series of cards depicting their equipment, also advertising the farm and home show. 2 more, both are relatively modern cards. The one on the lower left looks old, but it's not. And then the card on the lower right is probably the oldest one, but still from the 50s. 4 miscellaneous cards. I get a kick out of the using your postcard. You wouldn't even know it's a postcard. And I'm thinking to myself, how cheap is it that a company is going to go out and take a photograph of their billboard and make a postcard out of it? You know, I mean, to me, that seems a little like a Wisconsinite, you know. Oster, a hand massager, a hilarious card. Postcard from EC Crop advertising their postcards. And for Mutual Savings and Loan, just typical advertising cards seen in the 60s, 70s for an array of services. Restaurants, I'm sort of touching on just a lot of miscellaneous subjects. The Bel Air Cantina, I picked that card up just a few months ago when I ate there. That's on North Avenue, I think 68 or some 60 something in North Avenue. Karl Rasch's out of business, probably the most famous German restaurant at that time. Mader's now the most famous German restaurant because they still exist. Toys in the upper right, they were in business over 100 years. And when I moved to Milwaukee, that was probably the most famous Chinese restaurant. I don't know that it was always reputed to be the best one, but it was the most well-known. And then the Boulevard Inn, which was on Highway 41, just south of the freeway. And when my wife and I moved to town, we lived on 42nd on Highland, right near the Boulevard Inn and right near Miller Brewing. And we ate Boulevard Inn for special occasions because we couldn't afford it for anything else. So we're almost at the end. Two completely disparate cards, but I enjoyed them both. The one on the upper left is the largest hide ever tanned in Milwaukee. In 1910, the Big Fed Fur Company tanned an elephant hide.
Oh,
I assume it's still the largest hide ever tanned in Milwaukee, but that was tanned in 1910. And then below that is a more modern card from the Wisconsin Anti-Tuberculosis Association informing a guy that his X-ray came back clean and he doesn't have tuberculosis. And I hope they didn't send out cards like that for people that did have tuberculosis. The end. Another novelty card, but no beer in this one. The place where you're treated the best and grumbled the most. Home sweet home in Milwaukee. So I knew I flew through that. I had a lot of cards and I kept finding and buying more cards and put them in the presentation, and I had to talk faster and faster to get it done. But if there are any questions, I'd be happy to entertain them. Otherwise, I appreciate your time.